Okay, so this week we have another double portion. And this week it is called Behar, which is the first portion, which is on the mount. And the second one, Bechukotai, which is in his statute or in his statutes, or huk is a statute or a command that we don't necessarily understand the reasoning for. So we are going to start in Leviticus 25, and I will start by saying that this is going to be an unusual teaching because it is not going to be the traditional one that you would think of on what this parasha covers. So Leviticus 25 in verse 1. And Yah spoke to Moshe on Mount Sinai. Okay, that's where we get Behar from. And it says, tell the people of Israel, when you enter the land I'm giving you, the land itself is to observe a Shabbat rest for Yah. So first of all, we see here that, this is where we get the title Behar from, because on Mount Sinai, this is where Yah is speaking to Moshe. And Behar is written Beit, Hay, and Resh. And, Beit, we know, means a house. Hay means revelation or spirit. And then the resh means head. So, but it also means like not only the head, but the top, okay, or the beginning. So in the word Behar, we have that the house of revelation is on top. And it is on the mount, on the Behar, that Yah is speaking this revelation to his house. So, and what is he going to reveal in this parsha is about the Shmittah, or the Sabbath rest for the land, and the Yovel, which is the 50th year, or the year of Jubilee. And so this parsha is really focusing on the land, okay? And we're going to look at what it says about the land, but we're going to look at a prophetic picture too. And one of the first things I want to look at here is like in verse 2, notice that it says that the land, when you enter the land that I am giving you, that the land is going to observe a Shabbat rest. Okay, so this is the land that Yah is giving. Okay, and it is actually not the word Natan, not the past form of Natan, which is to give. It is notin, which is in the present tense. So he is continuously, this is something that he's giving to Israel, the children of Israel, okay, his people. So the land of Israel is always a gift from Yah. And so as we begin here, let's go. I read verse 1 and verse 2. Let's go to verse 3. 6 years you will sow your field. 6 years you will prune your grapevines and gather their produce. But in the 7th year, it is a Shabbat of complete rest for the land, a Shabbat for Yah. You will neither sow your field nor prune your grapevines. You are not to harvest what grows by itself from the seeds left in your previous harvest, and you are not to gather from the grapes of your untended vine. It is to be a year of complete rest for the land. But what the land produces during the year of the Sabbath will be food for all of you. You, your servant, your maid, your employee, and anyone living near you, your livestock and the wild animals on your land, everything the land produces will be for food. So, this commandment specifically is addressing the land of Israel, okay? And it's talking about that this Sabbath is for the land, not necessarily for man. And, even though it's specifically applying to the land of Israel, we're not necessarily commanded to observe it outside of the land of Israel. But, going back to farmers years ago, and a lot of places still will like do crop rotations and let their land lie fallow during that time. But there is a difference here because this is not like what we're thinking of with crop rotations, because usually if you're a farmer and you have you're going to do crop rotations, you're going to let that field lie fallow, you're still using another field to produce crops. Mm-hmm. That's not what's happening here. Think about what Yah is saying here, that the whole land of Israel, nobody in the country is commanded to harvest or sow during that year. So they weren't to sow, they weren't to prune, they weren't to harvest, but they could eat what grew. So, and, when you think about that's a different story. To think about how much, faith you have to realize that it's not just, oh, one day I've got to be prepared, but the whole country has to be prepared for a whole year.
And two, God was showing that year, you don't have to get out and plow. You don't have to.
Yeah, you're not working.
Mm-hmm. You be with your family. You talk about me every day, the day of rest.
Yeah, they weren't. Yeah, they weren't having to really work. Yeah.
Fields and normally there's kitchen cooking, things like that.
Yeah.
But he's trying to say, depend on me.
Yeah, it was all depending on him.
Yeah.
And it was to realize that this land is not yours. It is Yah's, and we're only here to take care of it.
And he's the one that makes it produce.
Yeah, and he made it to produce. Mm-hmm. Yep, he tells them, that he can give them rain in season and not in season. Yeah. So, and if you think about too, what happens here, this was something that, as you're going through, because that's not really your land and it's not your crops, you couldn't go out and harvest them. But for the poor, normally they were going to be the ones who were gleaning of the sides of the fields. But now during the year of the Shmittah or the Shabbat year, that anybody walking through a field, if they got hungry, they could partake of it. So you could eat whatever. So it wasn't like no, anywhere, the whole year. Yeah, because nobody owned that field. It was Yah's. That year, it's Yah's, so anybody could partake of it. So if that rich owner looks like he's got all of that produce, no, it's not his. Anybody, and it was open for anybody to take that year. So it was a blessing for everybody. And so the way the rich are, I don't want to say they're losing out that year because it's not their crop, but it's Yah showing there's no respecter of persons here. Everybody's free to eat.
And the one else, he's showing them, you don't have to harvest.
Yeah,
people that walk through and they've got food, they get.
Yeah, everybody could eat it, but yeah.
And you found that also this week, what wasn't harvest fell off in the extra ground.
Yep. Yeah. And like Jack was saying, that whatever fell off the tree too, would go back into the ground and it would actually give nutrients to the soil too. So, so during that, Shmittah or sabbatical year, that we could eat freely of what grows. And then, once that was gone off of the trees in the field or whatever, then you could take what was stored from previous years. And so the land was to lay rest. It was supposed to rest during that time. And so really they couldn't really plant or sow until that 8th year. Okay. So after that 7th year was over in that 8th year. So that meant that they had to put their trust in Yah to provide for their existence for that whole year. And so really, how much is that we think about, oh yeah, we do it for Shabbat, and we're supposed to be doing it every day. But do we really rely on Yah for our sustenance every day? A lot of times we think about, well, I've made this money or I've done what, but it's Yah that's provided all of those means. And Yah is trying to train us to, during that cycle is that, yeah, it's about you might have done certain things, but this is not really you doing it. It was me allowing you to get that. So
in a way, Joseph used that.
During the 7 years
famine, then there's plenty, you know.
Yeah, to provide. Yeah, yeah. I told him to put up for those years of, yep. Yeah. Yeah, that was in Egypt. Yep. When so in a way, Egypt observed a 7-year or a 3-year because there were, yeah. So when we look too at this, one other thing I want to think about is that during the Shemitah year, like I said, it wasn't, nobody had like personal property. You know, anybody going about their business, that was like their land too. So they could partake of it, rich and poor alike. And so this made me think about in Acts chapter 10 in verse 34, it says this. Acts 10:34. That then Kefa addressed them and said, now I understand that God does not play favorites, but whoever fears him and does what is right is acceptable to him, no matter what people he belongs to. So it didn't matter if they had money or if they didn't have money, you know, everyone was free to 10:34.
10:34.
35. Mhm.
Yeah.
And so Israel must avoid doing activities that would keep the land from observing its Shabbat. So just as we are to have the weekly Shabbat for us to rest, here we see that the land was supposed to be resting too. And that Yah is trying to show us that the people and the land are tied together, that they're intertwined. And if we even go back to the garden, when man sinned in the garden, Yah, you know, basically it says, okay, there's going to be a consequence for your sin, but the land also suffered a consequence as well. If we go back to Genesis 3, and I'm going to go to verse 17. Okay, to Adam, he said, because you have listened to what your wife said and ate from the tree, which I gave you the order, you are not to eat from it. If the ground is cursed on your account, you will work hard to eat from it as long as you live. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, and you will eat field plants. You will eat bread by the sweat of your forehead till you return to the ground, for you were taken out of it. You are dust, and you will return to dust. And so here again, the land is suffering as well as the people here. So they are tied together because we are from the ground. Adam comes from Adamah, the dust. Okay, so when we think about, you know, like I said, the Shabbat being established, we have to go back to the beginning in creation week, but there's also another connection here because in the beginning of this parsha, if we go back and where we started reading in Leviticus in 25, it started and it said in verse 2 that the land was to observe a Shabbat for Yah. Okay. And it actually uses that phrase, Shabbat for Yah, twice. And it's used in verse 2 and in verse 4. And so if we think how this is linked with creation week, then there's another phrase in the creation week that is repeated twice. It was good. Is repeated on day 3 and day 6. And if we think about what happens on day 3, we have the land, the seas, the grass, the plants come forth, and the trees. Okay. So that happens on day 3, but then what happens on day 6? Man. So the phrase that the Shabbat for Yah is used twice, and it takes us back to the creation week, and we've got a phrase that's used twice in the creation week, and it links again man and the land with the 3rd day and the 6th day. So, you know, like I said in verse, you know, Leviticus 25, 4 and 5, which says this is to be a complete rest for the land. This is to be a Shabbat. You're not to sow or prune the grapevines. So they were to have that land. So now this 7th year is also to remind us, I think, of how things were in the garden. Because think about in the garden, Adam and Eve were walking with Yah, and the plants and the things just gave forth their blessings and their fruit, and man was able to enjoy the produce of those without any effort. They didn't have to work. It wasn't until they sinned that the work came in. And so it all flowed from Yah's blessings, which comes about from his obedience, from obeying him. And so we think about what happens, Yah tells them that, if you're going to do this, that I'm going to pour out those blessings in that 6th year to cover for that 7th year, so that you're going to have that. If you are, but you have to plan ahead. It's not like I can decide today that, okay, for the next year, I'm not going to plant or reap a harvest. You had to, make like, okay, this is what I'm going to do, and make those in your mind, get your mindset. Okay, so Leviticus 25, I'm going to go ahead to verse 8. You are to count 7 Shabbats of years, 7 times 7 years. That is 49 years. Then on the 10th day of the 7th month, on Yom Kippur, you are to sound a blast on the shofar. You are to sound the shofar through all of your land, and to consecrate the 50th year, proclaiming freedom throughout the land to all of its inhabitants. It will be a Yovel, a jubilee for you. You will return everyone to the land he owns, and to everyone is to return to his family. That 50th year will be a Yovel for you, and in that year you are to sow, harvest what grows by itself, or gather the grapes of untended vines, because it is a Yovel. It will be holy for you. Whatever the field produces will be food for all of you. And in this year of Yovel, every one of you is to return to the land he owns. If you sell anything to your neighbor or buy anything from him, neither of you is to exploit the other. Rather, you are to take into account the number of years after the Yovel when you buy the land from your neighbor, and he is to sell to you according to the number of crops will be raised. If the number of years remaining is large, you will raise the price. If the number of years remain is few, then you will lower it, because what he is really selling you is the number of crops to be produced. Thus, you are not to take advantage of each other, but you are to fear Yah your Elohim. And so for he says, for I am Yah your Elohim. Okay. So when we look at this, the 7 cycles of the Shmittah, the 7 Sabbaths here, brings us to the 50th year. And so that 50th year, so the 49th year is going to be a Sabbath, because that's the Shmittah. And then that 50th year is going to be the Yovel, which is also like the Shmittah. Okay, well, again, the land is not going to be cultivated. And so in that 50th year, then all of the inheritances revert back to their original owners, and all of the slaves are freed to return to their families. Yeah, all of their debts were canceled, because what happened? You sold yourself. If you had a debt, you sold yourself into slavery. If you go down to verse 23, it says the land is not to be sold in perpetuity, because the land belongs to me. You are only foreigners and temporary residents with me. So the Shmittah and the Yovel, really is trying to teach us that the land is Yah's. It belongs to him. And, during most years, we can use it. The land is like it's our own property, but that Yovel, we have to acknowledge in that it's not ours. It belongs to him. And that we really don't have a right to the land. And that, Yah is showing us that it's all his. He can control it.
Do they still observe that in Israel?
The Shmittah they do, not the Yovel.
No. Okay.
So the word Yovel, or the Jubilee, is actually the sound on the shofar, okay? The sounding of the ram's horn. And in verse 9, we see that the Yovel comes it's announced on Yom Kippur. Okay. So it is the shofar that's blown on Yom Kippur on the 50th year to announce. Okay. So it's the shofar that's blown during Yom Teruah. But if you go back to Numbers 10 and read the beginning of Numbers 10, it talks about the silver trumpets, that the silver trumpets would be, sounding your feast days and things like that. But the shofar was blown on Yom Teruah and the Yovel year. So the shofar wasn't really blown at the new moons or the burnt offerings and stuff like that.
You gotta think too, it talks about they have to live off for like 2 years.
Yeah.
Because they have to let the land rest and all that.
Mm-hmm.
And people look at the numbers on that, but they don't really understand. And God provided that food. It wouldn't get raw. It did not. It lasted them.
Well, no, it wouldn't necessarily last. They had to, provide. They put it up.
Yeah,
that grain and stuff. Like the fruit, the fruit wouldn't. Yeah, the fruit would go bad. But yeah, that's why they ate of it first. You ate of the things first, and then you went to your stockpile of stuff. Okay, so this is where we're going to start getting into some of the other stuff. First, looking historically, I couldn't find any evidence where Israel ever observed a Jubilee, a Yovel. The only mention that I found is actually in the Gemara, and it's in Arachin 12b. And for those who watch later, I'll put all of the links in the description box so that you can go look at this too. But it mentions here, it says that the counting of 17 Yovels were from the time they entered the land until the exile. So when Joshua and them came into the land until they entered the exile, there were 17 Yovels. Yet it mentions only the counting of them. It doesn't really say that they observed them. It just says that there were 17. It doesn't say that they observed them. And so, something else interesting is when you look at how that they interpret these verses about the Yovel, when it talks about when you come into the land, and it's talking about, they're interpreting this as when all of the tribes are coming into the land. And so they see it that the Yovel, the Jubilee, only applies when all of the tribes are living in the land.
I know nobody said it either.
Yeah, we don't see it ever observed in Scripture. Yeah, we see it. So towards the end of the first temple period, we know that, the northern kingdom, the 10 tribes, were exiled. And so, and the Torah states that, that you shall proclaim liberty to the land and to all its inhabitants. So that's why that they're saying, they interpret that as that's when all the tribes are there. So therefore you don't observe it. That's their reasoning.
And that's why they don't do it today in Israel.
Yes.
Because not all the tribes are living.
They're not saying, yeah, they're saying that all the tribes are not in the land. So they don't, so, and that Joshua, let's see, Angelina said too. No, not the Yovel, because that's every 50 years. Yeah. And Angelina says that Joshua's time, there are a few tribes who chose not to come into the land. Well, yeah, when you think about Reuben, his side was over on the across the Jordan, and then the half tribe of Manasseh. Mm-hmm. And yeah. So, was there another half tribe? I can't remember. So
yeah.
But when you still look at that, that's their reasoning, is they're saying here, they're not in the land, and that's why they don't observe the Yovel. Well, you've got to think every 50 years. Okay, so when you look at this, yeah, we don't know. I don't know. But the Shmittah, the 7th year, is observed in the land. And even today, like when we were there, many religious Jews will not eat of the fruit of the land, and most of the farmers, I will say, that do observe the seventh year, the Shmittah year, and that what they did is they imported the items. So they, yeah, they would, yeah, the grocery stores and everything, they would get things imported during that time, which of course meant that meant prices for everybody else is going to go up during that time because they are importing those, but they were letting the land rest. And I know when I was there, I took my kids, my class to the farm. We went out to near Renana, and it was through an organization, Leket Israel, which actually helps farmers, and they glean stuff off the farmers' field, and they are an organization that donates to the poor. So that was and all of their people, like I was one of them, that come out there and they volunteer their time to help glean. And then when I was there, it happened to be during the harvest of the tomatoes. And so, yeah, I took my students, and that's what we did. We actually went and gleaned this farmer's field of tomatoes, and then we, put them in boxes, and they take them and they give them to the poor and needy across the land. And so that was something that
well, that was teaching the kids too, because without ever trying being there, now
yeah,
they can't observe a lot, because in the wars going on.
Yeah. And true. And like Angelina just mentioned, she said, because some of the tribes weren't in the land, that's possibly why there's never been a recorded Yovel. So, okay. So when we look at this, each year, the year of Yovel, like I said, was proclaimed at Yom Kippur. And Yom Kippur, this is what was happening. They're proclaiming and announcing freedom throughout the land. And everyone's going to be restored to their inheritance. And we think about, well, what is Yom Kippur? Yom Kippur happens to be when the most solemn days, and you think about you're fasting and you're praying that day. But there's a link here with not only Yeshua, what he did, being a picture of that Yom Kippur sacrifice, and he is releasing us. Okay. But if we go over to the book of Luke, let's go to Luke chapter 4 and look at what Yeshua says. This is when Yeshua is in Nazareth. Okay, so he's in Nazareth and he is going up to the synagogue. I'm going to go down to verse 16. Now, when he went to Nazareth, where he had been brought up on Shabbat, he went to the synagogue as usual. He stood up to read, and he was given the scroll of the prophet Yeshayahu, Isaiah. And unrolling the scroll, he found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of Yah is upon me. Therefore, he has anointed me to announce good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for imprisoned and renewed sight for the blind, to release those who have been crushed, to proclaim a year of favor of Yah." And after closing the scroll, returning it to the Shamash, he sat down, and the eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fixed on him. And he started to speak with them. "Today, as you have heard it read, the passage of the Tanakh was fulfilled." Everyone was speaking well of him and marveling at such of the words that were coming from his mouth. And they were even asking, could this be Joseph's son? And then Yeshua said to them, "No doubt you will quote me this proverb, 'Doctor, cure yourself.' We've heard about all these things you've been going over that have been going on over in Capernaum. Now do them here in your hometown." Remember, for those who've been to Israel, Capernaum is up by the Sea of Galilee. That's where Peter's family lived, and that's where the synagogue, and Yeshua stayed there and preached there a lot too. So, and he says, "Now do them in your hometown." "Yes," he said, "I will tell you that no prophet is accepted in his hometown. It is true. I'm telling you, when Eliyahu was in Israel and the sky was sealed off for 3.5 years so that the land suffered a severe famine, there were many widows, but Eliyahu was sent to none of them, only to a widow in Zarephath in the land of Zidon. And there were many people with Zarephath in Israel during the time of Elisha, but only one of them was healed, and that was Naaman the Syrian. And on hearing this, everyone in the synagogue was filled with fury. Okay, so think about what he's saying and why this is such a big deal and why they're getting mad at him. Because if we look at what he's quoting, so let's go to where he's quoting this, and that's in Isaiah chapter 61. In Isaiah 61, this is where he is quoting this passage. The spirit of Yah Elohim is upon me, because Yah has anointed me to announce the good news to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom to the captives, to let out into light those bound in the dark, to proclaim the year of freedom and the year of favor of Yah, and the day of vengeance of our God, and comfort all of those who mourn. Yes, provide for those in Zion who mourn, giving them garlands instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning, a cloak of praise instead of a heavy spirit, so that they will be called oaks of righteousness, planted by Yah, in which he takes pride. So, in verse 1, he's announcing that freedom to the captives. Well, that word freedom is to roar, which is the same word that's actually used in Leviticus 25 and 10, where it talks about that what are they doing at the Yovel? They're announcing that freedom, and it is that same word, roar. Okay. And so it's used in reference to the Yovel. So this is where I think understanding the times is crucial, because remember, in the Gemara, in the Talmud, it is only mentioned that they had 17 Yovels, but there's never mentioned an observance. We don't really have evidence of it, that there was ever practiced, but I want you to think about, and this is what we don't understand, is what did those people believe during that time? When he's standing there in the synagogue and he's proclaiming this scripture, what did they think would happen? Okay, so, and I will put a link for this later. It is, so what do they really believe about the Messiah? And this is according to the Orthodox website Aish, which means fire. And they are not believers, I will say that up front, but this is something that they believed, and this is believed even then. It says, tradition states about the Messiah that he will be a direct descendant of King David, the son of Jesse, as it is written, a shoot will come forth out of the stock of Jesse, a branch will grow from his roots, Isaiah 1:11. The prophet Isaiah describes 6 qualities that the Messiah will be blessed. God's spirit will rest upon him, the spirit of wisdom, understanding, the spirit of counsel and might, the spirit of knowledge, and the fear of God, Isaiah 11:2. And in these qualities, the Messiah will excel over all other human beings. The Messiah will see through the sham of hypocrisy of this world. He will have the power to sense a person's spirit, thereby knowing his entire spiritual record and judging whether he is guilty or not. Regarding this power, it is further written that he will be filled with the spirit of the fear of God, and he will not judge by what his eyes see or decide by what his eyes hear, or his ears hear, Isaiah 11:3. They also believe that the Messiah will use this power to determine which tribe every Jew belongs to. And they're using the term Jew in reference to all Israel. Okay. He will then divide the land of Israel into land inheritances, with each tribe receiving its own portion. He will reestablish the Sanhedrin and the religious Supreme Court and the legislature of the Jewish people, and he will restore the sacrificial system as well as practices of the sabbatical year, or the Shabbat, the Shmittah, and the Jubilee year, or the Yovel. So this is what even Jews today believe about the Messiah.
And they don't want to hear it. They're scared to hear it. Just like these were scared from what he was saying.
Okay.
They've got no.
Well, they're not scared to hear that, because this is all their scriptures. This is what they're. What? Okay. So why are they so upset here? Okay. So think about what he's saying. Okay. Even here, they believe that the Messiah will be the one who is going to bring the Jubilee. Well, there hasn't been a Jubilee in the land. And we look at what, Israel just celebrated this May, Yom HaAtzmaut, that's Independence Day, 77 years old. Okay. So for them, the Yovel is going to be brought with Mashiach. Okay. That the Messiah is going to bring the Yovel. So think about their understanding when Yeshua said this passage was fulfilled. The issue is that they were looking at all of the other qualities of him being the Mashiach, because he's going to come back and he's going to get rid of this world system and us being oppressed by the Romans, instead of all of the other qualities of him being Mashiach. So that's what they were thinking in their mind. And that's why they're getting upset, because they're like, wait a minute. No, is he doing that? He wasn't doing that at that time. Well, not afraid. They want it to happen. They wanted Rome to be destroyed. But so here is, they were looking at this and they're seeing it. Yeah, there's this whole big picture of what the Mashiach is going to do, but they're looking for this part of it where he's going to come in and he's going to get rid of our oppressors and he is going to bring back all of this stuff. And that's not what he did at that first coming. They're looking at it. And so they're getting upset because they're seeing, well, you're not doing that. You say you're doing this, but they're only seeing the physical side of it. They're not seeing him applying the spiritual side of, I'm releasing you and I'm getting you, freeing you from the captivity of the punishment of death that's separating you from Yah. They're not seeing the spiritual aspect of it. They're only looking at, we're still under Rome's rule. Okay. And so this, Parashah has a lot to deal with the land. And
So the 50 year of Jubilee.
well, they did, but they don't observe it. No.
They were celebrating.
Well, they observed,
Because I had it.
50 years of them being a nation, but not, Okay. So when you think about what's happening here, okay, and this is where I'm going to go off. And I will just say this, that for those that are watching later, hopefully you will watch till the end, because there's going to be lots of things I'm going to go over and talk about. So we're going to talk about Synagogue of Satan. We're going to talk about the Khazars. Are Jews really Jews? What is the land? Okay, so many believers today have no connection to the land or to the Jewish people. And so I wanted to look at this a little more, since this is so heavily tied with what's going on today. Angelina says, pray, Yah, this needs to be talked about. And in light of current events, Yah knows what happens in this world. And, he arranges things, how he orchestrates them. It's, don't necessarily, we can't fathom how he does it. And I surely can't do that. But I do want to share this picture, because I put together 3 pictures here to share. And I'm going to turn it around so y'all can see the 3 pictures. Okay.
Oh,
So,
yeah.
there are 3 different pictures here, and they're all linked with this week. The top one sort of looks like a bat. Yeah. That is Yovel. Okay. Oh God, Yovel. Oh God, what was her last name? I just totally lost her last name. Raphael. Yovel Raphael. And if you don't know, Eurovision is a big singing contest, in Europe, whatever. And Israel usually participates in it, most of the time, because of it's based on votes and stuff like that, usually they're not going to do very well. Yuval Raphaeli, yes, it looks like a bat, and it looks like a bat for a reason, because she won second place in Eurovision from Israel. What a lot of people don't know is that she survived October the 7th attack. Why did she dress like that? Because Yarden Bibas, his children, and his wife, what did they have on? The little boys, the little red-headed Bibas children, had on their Batman stuff and loved Batman. And so her outfit is in memory of honoring the Bibas children. And so it's amazing that she won second place, okay? She survived this attack by hiding under her dead friends for 3 hours before someone. That's her. Okay. Yep, she hid under the bodies of her dead friends for 3 hours and played dead to survive. Okay. This picture on the left of the lady with her head covered is Zila. Zila Getz was on her way to the hospital to deliver her baby a few days ago and was shot in her car on the way to the hospital and her giving birth and killed. Okay.
And her husband's still in the hospital.
Yeah, so he was okay. Yeah, the baby is still critical from what I understand, but it probably, I think, will survive. So, but Zila, and then the other two on the right is Sarah and Yaron, and this was happened in America. And what a lot of people don't know is that, people are going, okay, well, these were, killed by, Palestinian extremists or whatever, but, or these people that side with that. But these two on the right are believers. They're Jewish, but a lot of people don't know because you don't come out in Israel and just announce you're a believer in Yeshua. They were believers. They worked for the Israeli government, the embassy, and they were here in America, and they were getting ready to get married. So he had just bought an engagement ring and had planned to ask her next week. So with all of that going on, I believe all of that is linked with what we're getting into, because there is no connection that many believers have with Israel. Not only with the land of Israel, but with the people of Israel. And with that lack of connection, there has been a lot of anti-Semitism going on. And, when we look at that, well, what does that really mean? And what does that really look like? And so I want to go through a little bit of this, because one, just to dive into how we are separated from things, is our view of eschatology, end times. Okay. It's been skewed through the centuries because we think about Yovel. Yovel is about returning us to our inheritance. What is our inheritance? If you ask most believers in church, what's your inheritance? I'm going to heaven. Okay. Many believe that heaven is their inheritance. And they're looking at being up there. And Angelina saying, all I can think of is I will bless those who will bless you and I will curse those who will curse you. Yep. And that's in Genesis 12. So we think about our inheritance is not going up to heaven.
It's coming down.
Yes. It says that the land is inheritance. In Psalms 135 in verse 12 is what Yeshua was quoting when he was actually doing the Beatitudes. Okay. In Matthew 5:5, Yeshua says, how blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the land. Well, where does he get that from? Psalms 135 and 12, it says, He gave them their land as a heritage to be possessed by Israel, his people. So, and the physical land is important, okay? Let's go to Zechariah chapter 8. Zechariah chapter 8. And I'm going to start in verse 1. A message came from Yahzebaot, and Yahzebaot says, I am extremely jealous or zealous on Zion's behalf. I am zealous for her with a great fury. Yah says, I am returning to Zion and I will live in Jerusalem. Then Jerusalem will be called the city of truth. Yah Zebaot's mountain, the mountain of the Holy One. So look at what this is saying. This is a prophecy. It hadn't happened yet. Yah himself says he's zealous over Zion. And he's zealous over it because he's going to live there. So he's not talking about coming back to America or coming to China or coming to Europe or Africa somewhere. He's talking about, I'm coming back here and this is where I've chosen to live. Okay. And not only that, but it says that this Jerusalem is going to be called the city of truth. And we know that it's Yah's holy mountain. Okay. If we go to Psalms chapter 17 and verse 8. Psalm 17 and verse 8. Okay. It says, protect me like the pupil of your eye. Hide me in the shadow of your wings. Okay. So when we read this a lot of times, we're like, oh, okay, y'all's going to, this is the Psalms. We think about David and he's talking about protecting us. Okay. And Deuteronomy, if you want to jot this verse down too, Deuteronomy 32, verse 10, it says, he found his people in the desert country in a howling, wasted wilderness. He protected them and cared for him and guarded him like the pupil of his eye. So it's talking about guarding his people like the pupil of his eye. If you think about if somebody's coming at your face, you're going to put your hand up. You're going to guard your eyes, okay? And we claim these verses for ourselves, but we tend to look away at other verses that use that same phrase, okay? Because not only are the people, we want to apply that to us as being the pupil of his eye, but so is the land. In Deuteronomy chapter 11, verse 12. Deuteronomy 11, verse 12. It is a land Yah cares for. The eyes of Yah, your Elohim, are always on it from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. It's talking about the land of Israel. So it is the land he cares for. If we love him, then we should care about what he cares for. And he says his eyes are on it always, from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. He's always looking at his land. Not only that, but in Zechariah chapter 2 and verse 12. Zechariah 2 and verse 12 says, for Yah Zebaot has sent me on a glorious mission to the nations that plundered you. And this is what he says, anyone who injures you injures the very pupil of my eye. Well, what's he talking about? He's talking about the plunder and the pillage of Jerusalem, of Zion. And he says, anyone who plunders you is going to basically be like sticking their finger in my eye. I know there's a song I love, and I'll have to send it to y'all. It's Hine Lo Yanum, which is behold, he who neither slumbers nor sleeps. That song.
Oh, yeah, I love this song.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's a version of it that I can't remember. Did Ted Pierce or Joel Chernoff do it? And it is very jazzy. And one part of it, he says, you better watch out because you're sticking your finger in God's eye. And that's basically what we're doing when we're coming and touching his land.
And the center of it.
It's the center of his eye, or of his eye is the most important. Yeah.
So he's God said it's, and I mean, they do it, you know, like Yeshua did. He's in the center of God's eye is Jerusalem.
Yeah, that's Jerusalem is the center of his eye. And you think about it, okay? So Yah says he is basically going to protect Jerusalem.
That's the most important thing for him, you know.
So he says that he's going to protect Jerusalem. In Psalms 48, and I'm going to go to lots of different places here. In Psalms, I'm going to go to a couple of different passages. 48, verse 1. This is a Psalm of Korach. Remember, Korach is the one who rose up against Moshe. But it says, great is Yah and greatly to be praised, the city of our God, his holy mountain, beautiful in elevation, the joy of all whole earth, Mount Zion on the far north, the city of the great king. There's the song we used to sing in the church.
Oh, yeah. Well,
Yeah, I remember this one. Okay.
Yep.
So this is, I mean, this verse, this is the whole song. So we would sing. And so we actually, look at this. We often read over these passages, but we miss what it's saying. It says Zion, Jerusalem is the city of Yah. It's his city. It's going to be where he dwells. This is why it's the center of his eye. It is where he dwells. If we go over to chapter 137, this is another one of my favorite songs. I love Ben Schnoff's version of this one. It is, if I forget you, O Jerusalem, may my right hand, its cunning loser, wither away. May my tongue stick to the roof of my mouth if I fail to remember you, if I fail to count Jerusalem as the greatest of all my joys. That's 137, 5 and 6. So just think about that for a minute. It says, out of all the joys in your life, your children, your family, whatever, out of all the joys, Jerusalem should be your greatest joy. And it says, if I forget then my right hand should lose its skill. I shouldn't be able to use it. My tongue should cleave to the roof of my mouth. And, if I forget to make Jerusalem my greatest joy. And Psalms 102, verse 14. And this is why I have this. Okay. Psalms 102, verse 14. You will arise and take pity on Zion, for the time has come to have mercy on her. The time determined has come. For your servants love her very stones, and they even take pity on her dust.
Can I say that?
Yep. So what is this? This is a stone from Jerusalem that I picked up. So, and it's very interesting because a lot of tourists, when tourists are there, because you'll see them and they'll go around and they pick up stones and bring home stones. You bring home dirt. You would think about, why is that? It's a big deal. It's because this Psalm says that his servants will even love the stones and will even, take pity on the dust. And so the servants of Yah have mercy on Zion. They're going to love those stones of the city. And so hopefully you can start seeing that as a believer, you should have a connection to the physical land. We should be watching what's happening there because the land of Israel is important to Yah. And in Joel chapter 3, it depends on which version your Bible is, But in Joel chapter 3, it might be verse 1 or it might be chapter 4. Where it says, for then at that time, when I restore the fortunes of Yehuda and Jerusalem, I will gather all nations and bring them down into the valley of Jehoshaphat. What is the valley of Jehoshaphat? That is the valley between the Mount of Olives and the Temple Mount. Okay. That Kidron Valley, it's called the Valley of Jehoshaphat. Okay. And Jehoshaphat means Yah judges. Okay. And it says, I will enter into judgment there for my people, my heritage Israel, whom they scattered amongst the nations. And then they did what? Divided my land. So Yah saying he's going to judge the nations because they divided his land. Okay. Now, with COVID, lots of things in the world changed. And Eddie always likes to say that I'm a conspiracy theorist, and I do get into some conspiracies, but I don't get into all of them. And that is something, it just depends. And with COVID, there were all of these cover-ups and many things now, have been coming out, about, COVID and all these conspiracies, and that, many people have become so untrusting. And while there are valid points in some conspiracies, you got to think about too, that the enemy, Hasatan, doesn't come at you with a blatant lie. Just think about if he comes at you with a blatant lie, you're going to know it's a blatant lie and you're going to say no, But he usually comes at us with the truth mixed with the lie.
Yeah,
Just just like with Eve in the garden. And that's how she's deceived. Yeah. And you think about it, it was usually, even the word says Adam wasn't deceived, it's the women. And I think a lot of times we get into it because of the fact that we tend to be more sensitive to the Ruach in many areas. And but because of that, we can be I don't want to say easily, but easier to be led astray. And one of the conspiracies that is out there, conspiracy theories, is based in the fact, we do need a covering. It's based in the fact that the Rothschilds helped establish the nation of Israel. And because the Rothschilds were seen as not good people, they're bad people here, that many see the establishment of the nation of Israel as illegitimate. So because the Rothschilds are bad, Israel is not really a real nation. It's, Yah didn't establish it. So therefore, whatever. Okay. And I want to go to Isaiah 66, because this is a verse that many will see in relation to the establishment of the nation of Israel. Isaiah 66 and verse 8. It says, whoever heard of such a thing, who has ever seen such things, is a country born in a day, is a nation brought forth all at once. For as soon as Zion went into labor, she brought forth her children. So on May 14th, 1948, David Ben-Gurion, who was the chairman for the Jewish Agency for Palestine, is what it was called then, announced the formation of the state of Israel, and he declared independence. And one of the things that he said was that the Nazi Holocaust, which engulfed, this is his words, quote, the Nazi Holocaust, which engulfed millions of Jews in Europe, proved a new urgency for the reestablishment of the Jewish state, which would solve the problem of Jewish homelessness by opening up the gates to all Jews and lifting the Jewish people to an equality in the family of nations. So Ben-Gurion saw the horrors of the Holocaust as paving the way for the Jewish state. And, he wasn't alone in making that suggestion. And, so would the miracle of the recreation of the state of Israel ever happen without the Holocaust. We really, question that, because when you look at the world opinion, they were not going to vote in favor of the establishment. But after everything came out about the Holocaust, and it's interesting though too that you think about, there's a big push about socialism in America, and we want all this socialism, and people forget that what does Nazi stand for? The National Socialist Party. That's basically what they were, the National Socialist Party. Okay, so and it's interesting here that all of this happened in 1948. Okay, because if we go back to Genesis, in Genesis, and we start at the very beginning and we go through those genealogies, and those are boring a lot of times. And I went through, and remember one year I went through and I made a chart, and I actually put it in an Excel spreadsheet, and I will share my screen right here so that way you guys online can see that. Let me go right here. This, because there. Okay, so here's one. No. So I did a little Excel spreadsheet, and I actually put like starting at Adam and all of the children down the genealogy, starting Adam at 0, and then how old he was when he had Seth, and then how many years did he live after that, how old was he when he died, and then what year would that have been from creation. Okay, so I went through Adam, Seth, Enosh, Canaan, Mahalalel, Yared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, Noah, and then so Adam starting at 0, you're going up how old he was. This would have been the year, corresponding year, when he died. Okay, so when you go to the approximate year, keep going from Noah, Shem, Arpachshad, Shelah, Eber, Peleg, Rui, Serug, Nahor, and Terah, and then we get to Abraham. From the time of creation, if creation, we're starting Adam at 0 and counting up, Abraham would have been born in the year 1948 after the creation of Adam. Okay, and we think about Abraham. Abraham was the father of Yitzhak, who was the grandfather of Yaakov, who was Israel. And he's considered, everybody considers Abraham being Father Abraham. Remember the little song, Father Abraham had many sons? Okay, so, and that was the same year, 1948 is the same year that Israel was established as a nation. Well, who declared it a nation? David ben Gurion. David ben, son, Gurion, Gur, lion. David, the son of the lion, is the one who announced the nation of Israel in 1948. Okay. His hair, his hair. He was a short little man too. And you know what? Even after, because we went to his house, remember? He lived on a kibbutz. After he became prime minister, you would think he would live in a big, nice house in Tel Aviv or something like that. No, he lived on a little bitty kibbutz at a farm overlooking the wilderness of Zin, where the children of Israel roamed for 40 years. In his, his graveyard. It's just a simple little grave. Yep. Nothing special about it. But one of the things he said is that if you really want to know Israel, you had to understand what he saw out his front door. And he said, I look out and I see where they wandered for 40 years. And to understand Israel, you got to understand why we wandered for that long. Yeah. And that's, I always thought that was just, Okay. So for me, I see only Yah aligning those dates. Okay. But, some people may say, well, no, not whatever. Okay. So let's get back to the Rothschilds, because there are people that are going to say no. So in essence, if you don't agree with that Yah aligned those dates to, be from the time that Abraham was born, from creation, being the same year that the establishment of the nation of Israel. In essence, their premise is that since the Rothschilds were bad, that the establishment of the nation of Israel is illegitimate. Okay, so that's their premise. And that basically what they're saying is that Yah can't use someone from the nations to fulfill his promises. He can. What about King Nebuchadnezzar? Okay, in Jeremiah chapter 25, look at what it says, what Yah says about Nebuchadnezzar. Jeremiah 25. Remember, Nebuchadnezzar is the king of Babylon. Not necessarily a good person, okay? Jeremiah 25, verse 9 says, I'm going to send for all of the families of the north, says Yah, and for my servant Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, and bring them against the land and its inhabitants against all the surrounding nations, and I will destroy them, making them an object of horror and ridicule, a perpetual ruin. So he's calling Nebuchadnezzar his servant, and he's saying, I'm going to end up destroying part of my land here. Okay, if we go over to chapter 27 in Jeremiah, in verse 6, he again says that Nebuchadnezzar is a servant. It says, for now I have given over all of these lands to my servant Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babel, and I have also given him the wild animals to serve him. So Yah uses Nebuchadnezzar to bring about his plans for Jerusalem and to fulfill his purposes in the land.
Didn't he also use the king of Assyria?
Yeah, he used the king of Assyria to do that too. And think about Balaam. You know, Balaam or Bilam, you know, and Balak, okay? In Numbers chapter 22, remember what the king of Moab did? He sent for Balaam and he brings him up and he's like, you know, I want you to curse the children of Israel. Well, Balaam was a prophet for hire. But instead of cursing them, he ends up blessing them. And so God can use people that aren't righteous to fulfill purposes.
Yeah.
And just because that person isn't righteous doesn't mean that God's promise was negated. So, you know, just because Balaam wasn't necessarily a righteous prophet and he was a prophet for hire, he still blessed Israel, and that blessing still stands. Okay, just like, you know, so the thing with the Rothschilds, well, just because they're bad people, if they poured a whole bunch of money into helping establish the state of Israel, Yah can do that. He can use someone bad to fulfill his purposes. Think about Pharaoh and Joseph in Egypt. He used, he used Pharaoh, who was, he was a pagan, you know, he thought he was a god. He was a pagan king, a pagan leader, but yet Yah used him and to show favor toward Joseph and to bring, you know, about his plan to lead them into, you know, eventually into exile. I mean, not exile, but out of the land of Egypt.
And you go back, what if you go back forth in history, you can see God's hand. What a lot of people probably know this, is some people know that Washington.
Oh yeah, you talking about?
Saved, I mean, George Washington.
Yeah. I don't have a dollar bill.
I don't either.
Okay.
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you know, because there's a lot of pagan symbols on the dollar bill, but there's also something to honor Israel on the back of a dollar bill. And so yeah.
That's why George Washington.
Yep.
Got them through, so we could help. You know,
Yep. I was trying to remember what was his last name.
yeah. I had.
Wait a minute. Let me think. I was trying to remember it and I don't remember. Solomon.
Yeah.
Time Solomon.
Yeah.
Yeah. It takes me a minute because sometimes I got so much stuff in there. Okay. Yeah. So, I don't know if you.
Trust.
Yeah, and then you got in God we trust, and then you got all the paganism too. We got the all seeing eye, whatever. But over on this side, we also have a link with Chaim Solomon,
Yes.
because the stars, if you look at the stars, actually make the Star of David, and they had that done in honor of Chaim Solomon. Because for those of you who don't know the story of Chaim Solomon, during the American Civil Revolution from the British, and we're trying to win our independence. And I don't know if you remember the story of the Winter of the Red Snow, which basically it was the winter and all of our troops were basically walking through the snow and they're barefoot and their feet. It was called the Winter of Red Snow because you saw their feet. And we're basically going to lose to the British. And we had no more money. We didn't have anything. And so, George Washington, being the general at that time, had a friend who had money, and that person was Chaim Solomon, and he was a Jewish man.
Right.
And George Washington goes to the city. I'm not sure. I don't think it was Philadelphia. I don't remember where it was. I have to go back and look. And he goes looking for Chaim Solomon. Can't find him. Goes to his house, and the lady answers the door and says, "They're at the synagogue. It's Yom Kippur. What are you doing? You're not going to find him here." And so George Washington goes to the synagogue on Yom Kippur, knocks on the door. They open the door, whatever, and he's like, "I need to talk to him. I've got to talk to him about business." And they're like, "No, we don't do business. Today is not the day." But Chaim Solomon came out and he said, "The survival of the nation depends upon this." He said, "I will give you the money." And basically, Chaim Solomon funded the rest of the American Revolution.
Yeah.
And so, as a tribute, they honored him on the back. Oh, you can't see my dollar bill, but they honored him on the back of the dollar with not only the stars, but if you count the arrows, and the menorah at the bottom, and also when you count the arrows, is 13 in reverence to the 12 tribes plus the United States, and the Star of David. So that was just a little thing. And I think we also made a stamp in honor of him. You don't ever hear about that. No. Yeah. Because of I think part of it is the anti-Semitism, and we want to look at, what this is. Okay. So this is one thing, and it doesn't mean that person, just thinking about, with them, they were not necessarily good people, but Yah can still use them. Okay. Another issue that comes up is the issue that, well, the Jews today aren't really the real Jews. They're actually the Khazars who converted to Judaism. Okay. And so this is another one. Sorry, but that's this one. And so a couple of things here stick out with me. One, the Khazars, they're saying converted to Judaism, therefore they're not real Jews. So they're saying that just because they converted, then they're not real Jews. In other words, conversion makes you inferior to the natural born. And then I'm sitting here thinking, well, wait a minute. If that's the case, and then we're grafted in Gentiles, then we got a problem, because we're not real Jews either. So we wouldn't be, if that's the case, then we wouldn't have a valid point. We weren't, we would be inferior. And that really doesn't hold up with scripture either, because if we go to Leviticus chapter 24, and verse 22, it says, "You are to apply the same standard of judgment to the foreigner as the citizen, because I am Yah, your Elohim." Okay, so not only does it say it here in Leviticus chapter 22, but if we go back to chapter 19 in Leviticus, in verse 33, it says, "If a foreigner stays with you in your land, do not do him wrong. Rather, treat the foreigner staying with you like the native born among you. You were to love him as you love yourself, for you were foreigners in the land of Egypt, for I am Yah, your Elohim. And also, you can just jot this one down in Exodus 12 and 49. It says the same teaching, the same Torah is to apply equally to the citizen as well as to the foreigner living among you. So, where does this come from then that Jews today aren't really real Jews, that they're really the Khazars? So I got to looking at it and I dug it up. It actually comes from a book called The 13th Tribe, written by Arthur Kessler. So I went online and found a copy of the book and I got the book so I could read it. Arthur Kessler was a Jew. So why would he say something like this about his own people if he wasn't true? You know?
And he said 13 tribes.
No, he called his book The 13th Tribe because he's basically saying that Jews today are not real Jews, that they converted to, they're actually the Khazars that converted. Okay. So, so why would he say that if he's a Jew? Why would he say that about his own people if it wasn't true? That's one of the, things that come up. This is why we believe him, because he's a Jew. He's basically laying out there about all the things that are not true about them. But we need to understand the background of what was happening with Arthur Kessler. Okay. First, Arthur Kessler was an Austrian-Hungarian Jew. Austrian-Hungarian or Austro? I don't know. Austro-Hungarian or Austrian-Hungarian, however you say that. Jew. He was raised in Budapest and up until 1940s. So he lived in Austria-Hungary when, think about Franz Ferdinand was shot, you think about World War I, World War II, okay? So he lived through World War I in that area. That's where World War I started, okay? Franz Ferdinand being shot. He grew up, he was Jewish. There was a lot of anti-Semitism that was happening in Europe during that time. But even though he was Jewish by birth, he didn't really believe in the Bible. He wasn't a practicing Jew. Actually, he was the opposite. He was an atheist.
Yeah.
And in many ways, he was like Hitler because he was fascinated with the paranormal and this, supernatural stuff. Even upon his death, he donated all of his stuff to paranormal stuff. Okay. So that's the man who makes this statement. He was somebody who didn't even believe in God, didn't believe in the Bible, even though he was Jewish, whatever. Okay. So, well, some question that. Some, yeah. So when you look at his book, and this is what I started reading in his book, he says, Arthur Kessler says in his book, and I quote, in this last chapter, I've tried to show evidence from anthropology that concurs with history in refuting the popular belief in a Jewish race descended from the biblical tribe. Okay, so he says that he's trying to show evidence from anthropology that Jews today don't really have any connection to the Jews of the Bible. Okay? So he's wanting to disassociate the Jews of the Bible with the Jews today. Okay? Now, and he says through anthropology. His biographer, which was Michael Scammell, who wrote a book about, he knew Kessler, and he wrote a book about Kessler's life and everything. He told the French biologist Pierre de Bray-Retzin, he says, I quote, that he was convinced, Kessler was convinced that if he could prove that the bulk of the Eastern European Jews, those that are considered Ashkenazi, that they were descended from the Khazars, that anti-Semitism would be removed and that it would disappear. So the guy who wrote Kessler's biography, that knew Kessler, actually tells why Kessler said those things about Jews. It's because he wanted to dissociate the Jews of the Bible from the Jews today, saying these aren't the same people, so you shouldn't be treating us today bad because of what happened then. Okay. So his reasoning for writing this book is really to stop anti-Semitism. But it actually did the opposite, because what happened? The anti-Semitics saw this, that he's saying that, and they're saying, see, they're not real Jews, and they're taking it. Now, and they've run with it. So they've taken this man who says he's trying to prove this, and using anthropology and scientific evidence, but yet he never gives any scientific evidence. And when you start really looking into it today, it's been easily debunked. And I will put in the links. I found a lot of different things here. The National Library of Medicine actually has an article that says there is no evidence from the genome-wide data from the Khazar origin that it's linked with Ashkenazi Jews. I've got 3 other articles that I will link in here with, genetic testing that they've done, and it's basically virtually every field of science says that there's no evidence whatsoever of that. Okay. And for instance, even the historians stress that they don't ever see anywhere where the people that lived in this area, Khazaria, ever converted to Judaism. The archaeologists that have excavated in the former lands of Khazar have found almost no artifacts displaying Jewish symbols. And when you look at the language that they spoke, it is no way similar to Yiddish, which is what the Eastern European languages our Jews spoke. They're no way similar to the language of the Khazarian Jews. Because even today, I mean, when you think about there's still words that they use today that have links. I mean, you think about the Mennonites, and how, the link, what is it? Or you think about the Dutch. Yeah, you think about the Dutch and the words that come forth with some of those, and they are still passed on, like Rumspringer and stuff, okay? But even with Yiddish, like Bubby, okay? Yeah, Bubby, or that's Yiddish. And then I was trying to think of Gesundheit. Gesundheit is Yiddish. Bubby is grandmother, brother. Bubby is grandma, and Gesundheit. I don't know. Are y'all familiar with? Are y'all familiar with Gesundheit? Yeah. We say that in the South when you sneeze. Okay, so but actually has origins in Yiddish. So, but when you look at their language, there's nothing alike. Okay, even when you look at names, when you go through and scientifically look at the names of that region, there are not any Jewish surnames in that area that contain any link to Khazaria. Okay. Like I said, I've got 3 or 4 articles I'll link in the description box too. And there's another one about the link between the DNA of the Cohen line and that too. So
what just comes to my mind is that when you even it's not known in his own land.
Yeah.
And his name was different. You remember when they were going to name him?
Mm-hmm.
And basically it's Hoshua,
yeah.
Yeah, well, there's a bunch of
and there, yeah.
Joshua,
yeah.
Joshua is Hoshua, and they said, find the name in him. It's not a known name in your family.
Yeah, there's not a name in your family. Yeah, because a lot of times they're going to name their sons, like with Mordecai and Leah, when they had their first son, they name it after someone in their their family. Yeah, and so they had a hard time picking out a name that they liked because of their ancestors, and they ended up settling on Hillel. So their firstborn was Hillel. That was what they named him. So.
Yeah, they still carry that on.
Yeah, and so does Yah then do away with his covenant because there are wicked people? No. Yeah, he can use it. Think about even his covenant and his promise that he made to King David. He says that his line would forever be king. And yet, throughout the books of First Kings and Second Kings, we see that the kingdom of Judah had good kings, but they also had bad kings. Jehoshaphat was a good king in chapter 22. He did what was right from Yah's perspective. And Hezekiah in 2 Kings chapter 18, he was a good king. Okay. But yet there were many bad kings in Judah's history. So did Yah forsake his promise to Judah, even though there were bad people in charge? No. Okay.
Well, it's just like now, Bridges Peace, Christian Friends of Israel, Zion, all those ministries that are in Israel have been out there 30 to 50 years.
Right.
Serving and doing and feeding, and they go speak in churches and everything. They don't care who gives. God's got people to give to help. I mean, I've been with them 30, 40 years.
I mean, are you going to say, I'm not going to take your money because you're not a believer? I mean, how many, or to think about, okay, well, think about the opposite. What if you're going to the doctor? If you need heart surgery, are you going to tell that doctor, you can't do surgery on me unless you're a believer? I mean, most of the time, no. So,
but no, any kind of help.
Yeah.
I mean, in the same way,
Yah uses whoever. And sometimes, because even think about with Ruth, he tells her that not Ruth, Esther, that if you're not going to do it, I'm going to raise somebody else up. Angelina said, Angelina said, repeat a lie enough times and it becomes the truth. Yep. What a mess. There's so many anti-anything Jewish because of this. You got it.
When you hear things or see things on all this YouTube, TikTok, all that stuff, you better start stuff out before you believe stuff and start speaking to somebody else, because this gonna lead to a whole mess.
Right. Yes. What?
God said that he would always have a remnant for himself.
Yeah, Eddie was saying that Yah said that he would always have a remnant for himself. Yep.
Always.
And you think about this. Okay, so the land of Israel today does not have a king. Their form of government is a parliamentary republic. Okay, so a parliamentary republic basically works similar to our republic. Okay, we are a republic, not a democracy. So,
why does everybody say each state so much?
Yeah, that's a pet peeve of mine. Because that's what I told my kids. I said, okay, teaching sixth grade, let's stand. What? Yes, it is a brainwash thing. What do you say at the beginning of the day? We stand up and we say the pledge. Okay, so let's say the pledge. I pledge allegiance. Okay, you keep going to the republic, not to the democracy. There is a difference. What is the difference? And I used to illustrate this with my kids. If the majority in the class vote to go jump off the cliff, guess what? If you are in a democracy, we all gonna go jump off that cliff. If you are a republic, you choose a person that you think is wise. Y'all choose and you say, okay, well, you know what? I think Eddie is really, really wise. So we're going to put him in charge. And so when the time comes for the vote and they say, do we jump off this cliff? Eddie votes no. Then we're like, okay, no, we're not going to jump off the cliff. So that's the difference between a republic and a democracy. Okay. And a parliamentary republic is like England. Okay. They have a parliament that works. Okay. So, and the politics in Israel is it's a mess in itself. But anyway, they still are a republic. So think about this. All of the Arab countries around them, are they a form of a republic or a free country where you get to vote?
No.
The majority are no. There are a few, but the majority are no. Guess what? Arabs have a vote in Israel's prime minister and government if they live in Israel. Yes, they get to vote too. They are citizens.
Yeah.
They have the right to vote. So it's not, okay. So anyway, you have that. So thinking about this type of government then, who is in essence to blame if you have a bad leader? The people. Yeah, the people who did. So it's basically the people's blame if you have a bad leader. Now, a lot of times we generalize and say that everyone's bad do we do that and say everyone's bad since the leader's bad? No. Because there are many within the country that are good, but yet the majority may have voted that way. And so that you've got this bad leader. And even many today, for example, and I'd love to have them give me a t-shirt that says West Bank with a big slash. Because many today, and even the media is bad about this, is referring to parts of Israel as the West Bank. Why was it called the West Bank? Well, that was because Jordan controlled all the way up to Jerusalem. They control that. But why do they still call it the West Bank?
Because it's in the West.
I think it stems back to the whole root of anti-Semitism, because is it going to sound good to call it by its biblical name? What do Jews call it today? Judea and Samaria. So you're going to say, let's get Judah out of Judea. Are you going to say that on the news? Because that sounds like, let's get the Jews out of Judah. That's what you're saying. That's, I think, one reason they don't call it that is because when you think about it, it doesn't make sense. That's why it was called Judah, is because that was Judah's territory. And that's where so, okay, with that. Now, let's get back to the Shmittah year. So,
but you have to look at it. The people that's anti-Semitic now, they get, I call it the excitement wagon. They get on and don't even know.
Well, they don't even know. A lot of people today are going on emotions and they don't understand the history. Okay. Yesterday, I was watching, and if you really want to watch a good documentary, I watched it last night. It's free on YouTube. It is called In Our Hands. In Our Hands, the battle over Jerusalem. And it goes through the 1967 battle. And it's really good because the parts of it, they go through and they reenact it. But they do have actual video footage of everything. And, it's weird to go back and look and you see Benjamin Netanyahu when he was young and he was and he's standing there at a 20-something-year-old guy, and he's in the military, and and then and you're sitting there looking at some of that, but it's so I was at one point I was just boohooing. I was absolutely boohooing because just to show you the mercy, this doesn't make mainstream news. This is why I don't watch mainstream news, and it doesn't make mainstream news, but Ammunition Hill in Jerusalem, which is a hill on Mount Scopus, which when you've got the Temple Mount here, you've got the Mount of Olives here, and then right here is Mount Scopus, okay? And there's a hill there called Ammunition Hill. And the Jordanians in 67 had control, of the old city and everything. Jews in 1948 no longer had control, or did not have control of the old city, and were not even allowed in at all, up until a certain point. Okay. So anyway, in 67, Iraq, Egypt, Jordan, who else? Iraq, Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon. Turkey. I don't think Turkey was in on it. All amass troops against Israel. It started in the Sinai, but it ended up in Jerusalem. And so here's the point I'm getting to is the worst battle in Jerusalem happened on Ammunition Hill. And there were 235 Israeli soldiers. I know at the end, I think there were like 35 or something. I can't remember how many that survived or whatever. But they fought all night long against all odds. And it ended up that they won Ammunition Hill. And the Jordanian troops ended up just leaving, and they just let them go, just they turned and ran and they let them go. They ended up going through the desert back over to Jordan. And when they did that, they sat there and lost a lot of their friends and stuff. They've been up all night fighting. What do? They take their own stretchers, the ones that were still alive, to hospitals or whatever. And then after that, they go back through. The Jordanian troops left there dead. They didn't come back to get them, didn't do anything. Those soldiers, Israeli soldiers, that had been up all night long, dug. Do you know how hard the dirt is around Jerusalem?
Oh.
It's rocks. They stayed there and dug for over 4 hours, mass grave, for the 17 dead bodies of the Jordanian soldiers that they found. And they put up a sign in English, and it had Zahal. It says Zahal is IDF. And it says, "Here lies 17 brave, courageous Jordanian soldiers." And one of the guys that did that, they asked him afterward, "Why did you do that? Why?" And he said, "It's not because we're honoring death. It's not because we're excited." He said, "We're honoring those lives that they fought bravely and they fought courageously, and we're honoring their lives." Now think about, would most people do that for their enemies in the midst of battle? You've been up all night long fighting, and these people that were just shooting at you and have killed, your best friends or whatever, you would sit there and you go, great. And I mean, I was boohooing by that point. I was like, oh my gosh, and it's just moving, because that never makes the media.
Yeah.
It never makes the news. You only see the bad things about Israel. You never see the heart, the compassion. And okay, I'll get off that, because I will show you one thing at the end, and I can guarantee it's going to make me cry. Okay, so let's get back to the study. So Yeshua says, you think about, he said, "If you've seen me, you've seen the Father." And we know Yeshua is a prophet like Moshe. Yah's name, the Yud He Vav He, is numerically 26. And Yeshua says, "If you've seen me, you've seen the Father." Well, the mirror image of 26, 2-6, is 62. Okay, the mirror image of it. Okay. There are 26 generations from Adam to Moses, because there are 20 generations from Abraham is the 20th generation from Adam, and Moses is the 6th generation from Abraham. So there are 26. Okay.
I don't know why I think it was 14 generations.
No, you're thinking 14, because what does Matthew 1 say about Yeshua?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
It breaks it up. Okay. So think about this. Now, 26 generations from Adam to Moshe. So Adam to Moshe, that's 26. And remember, Yeshua was going to be like a prophet under Moshe. Okay. He was going to be. Okay. So think about what happens here. Moses was like a god to Pharaoh. Well, God's name is 26. Okay, he was like a god to Pharaoh. The mirror image is 62. If we go over to Matthew 1 in verse 17, 14, 14, 14,
Yeah,
14, 14, 14
let's do it.
is 42.
Well, didn't you have the Moshe that he would be in his stead?
Yeah. So Abraham, so think about Yeshua. Yeshua was the 42nd generation from Abraham. So from Adam to Yeshua is 62.
Yeah.
Because Yeshua is the 42nd from Abraham. Abraham's the 20th to Adam. So Adam to Abraham is 20. From Abraham to Yeshua is 42. That's 62. Okay, 20, 42, 62. So from Adam to Yeshua is 62. So think about what this is. Moshe is 26. Yeshua is the mirror image of Moshe, is 62 in generations.
Mhm. Yeah.
And when you start looking, and I started looking, and one person that I know that's numerical that goes through all this stuff is Defy Tang, and he gets all into the numbers. And one of the things he was talking about there is Defy Tang. He's an Orthodox believer. He's Orthodox Jew,
Yeah.
but he's also a believer in Yeshua. Okay, so he still has the pale, and
Yeah.
he guess where he's from? He's Chinese. Well, not Chinese. He's Asian. I don't know. He's Asian, but he's a Jew. So it doesn't matter because, when you're a Jew, you're a Jew. It doesn't matter if you're black, you're white, whatever you're from, you're a Jew. Okay. But Defy Tang says when you started looking at, there were actually then, going back and counting, 26 Yovels, 26 Jubilees from Moses to Mashiach at his first coming. And he makes a link with Moses coming down from Mount Sinai, because when you start looking, rabbinically, Moses is believed came down from Mount Sinai after the sin with the golden calf on Yom Kippur. Okay, so what did he do? They offered the offering for the forgiveness of the children of Israel, which would have been on Yom Kippur, because it would have been, that he would ascended on the first day of the 6th month, and he descended 40 days later, which would have been the 10th day of the 7th month. So he links it to Yeshua going up on the mountain and praying and fasting for 40 days. And that what happens after Yeshua goes up on the mountain and fasts and prays after 40 days in the wilderness, he immediately comes down, he goes back to Nazareth, and what does he do? He stands up in the synagogue and proclaims Isaiah 61, which is the acceptable year, which is the year of Jubilee. And when you look at what he's quoting, he only quotes half of the verse. Yeshua didn't quote all of it out of Isaiah 61. And what he says, and he makes the connection here, is that the remaining part of what Yeshua didn't quote was because Yeshua didn't come to do the vengeance part of that. That's what he's going to do at his second coming. He only said the first part because this is what he's fulfilling at his first coming. And the second part he would do at his second coming. And if you look at John, and I looked at this and I never thought about this. John chapter 4, verse 34, and it just struck me when I was reading it. John 4, verse 34. Yeshua says, and I'm going to read it out of King James. John 4, 34. My meat is to do the will of him that sent me and to finish his work. Say ye not that there are 4 more months, and then comes the harvest. Behold, I say unto you, lift your eyes and look on the fields, for they are white already to harvest. So look at what Yeshua is saying. He says, looking out at the fields, paraphrasing, that the fields are ready for harvest. But he says, there are 4 more months, then comes the harvest. Well, if they're ready for harvest, why aren't they harvesting? Not that they're lazy. But when you look at the event, when this is with the timing of this, it would have been after, in John 2 and verse 23, it would have been after Pesach. So the harvest is ready, but Yeshua says there's got to be 4 more months into the harvest. Why would he say that unless this was a Shmittah year or possibly even the Jubilee year? Because it wouldn't be until after Rosh Hashanah that they could legally harvest again. And so if this is happening at Yeshua's timing, that his first coming was at a Yovel, is it possible that his second coming would be at a Jubilee too?
Because he tells them here, Mr. Charles,
No, yeah. And he says that there's there. You let her that it's it's already there. And to think about, if the children of Israel had to walk 40 years in the wilderness because of their unbelief, what about his brothers and sisters during his first coming of their unbelief? Would it be a 40 cycle for them too? And if we think, well, 40 times a 50, a Jubilee, if we think, okay, if you go back historically, really, Yeshua died around, it's believed around 28, not 30, but 28, okay, AD. So if that's true, that they've got a cycle of, the same amount of years, 40, and then 50 is the Jubilee, 40 times 50 is 2,000. So 2,000 plus the time that he died would be 28. So 2028. Now, I'm not setting any dates and saying that's when he's coming back. No. But there's an interesting connection there with the numbers and the pattern there. Defate? D-A-F-E-I. And his last name is T-A-N-G.
T-A-N-G. Okay.
He writes a lot for the Times of Israel, and he'll do blogs and stuff on that. But he really gets into numbers and pulls all kinds of stuff out there. But anyway. But if we think about those connections with the numbers, and remember, it was 1948 that when Israel became a nation again. And remember what Yeshua says about the fig tree. Okay, in Matthew 24 in verse 32, he uses the fig tree as a parable. And he says, let the fig tree teach you its lesson. When its branches begin to sprout and leaves to appear, you know that summer is approaching. In the same way, when you see all of these things, you are to know that the time is near, right at the door. Yes, I tell you that this people will certainly not pass away from all of these things happening. Well, in Hosea, in 9 and 10, we see Israel referred to as a fig tree. Israel's called an olive tree, but they're also called a fig tree, okay? So if he's teaching them with a parable here, and he's saying, when you see this, okay, well, if 1948 is when Israel was this young, tender fig tree that began to sprout and leaves begin to appear because they became a nation again, look at what he says. He says, okay, that I tell you that this people will not pass away before all of these things happen. Well, in Psalms 90, a generation is usually 70 or 80 years, because it says the span of our life is 70 years, or if we're strong, 80. So a generation is typically thought of to be a 70 or 80 years. Well, if we use the 70 years and the picture of Israel being a fig tree, that would be the 70 years being up in 2018. If we use the fig tree picture in Israel of 80 years, that would be the 2028, which basically both of them are a good chance for Israel to complete her mission in that time period. But I mean, it's just looking at the numbers there, it's just, I don't know. Okay. It's just amazing me to think about all the connections with the numbers. And even to think about this, okay, which I'm not even going to go into this, but I will mention it just for sake because, on the Hebrew calendar, we say that this year is 5785. But is it really 5785? Because we know historically, going back through the Jewish calendar, there are missing years, 165 missing years.
Yeah.
So that would make this year be what? 5950. Which is, that would be the Jewish year if you counted those missing years. Well, 5950, well, wait a minute. That's a Jubilee from 6,000. Well, wait a minute, okay, I'm just sitting here thinking about all the 6 days,
Well, on that verse 34 where it says, "Assuredly I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away." Well, that generation did pass away. But doesn't generations there mean race, that there will always be?
Well, we don't know. No.
Until the end.
Or if he's talking about Jubilees, but if he's talking about Jubilee, if he's talking about a Jubilee, then that would be that generation would, you know what I'm saying? That's why I was saying that if you look at those 20, if you look at the 70, then that means that if you look at the 70 years, then Israel being that would be 2018. But if you look at the 80 years, it would. I don't know. Yeah. Yep. It was because it's, yeah. I mean, that's what you start thinking is like, because they literally didn't see that happen. So. Yeah. But whatever, I'm not setting times for him coming, but I just think all those pictures play into what is it, how close we are to him coming, and to know that, when you start going back and you go back to the word in 2 Chronicles in chapter 36, he tells them that because if they don't do what he said, then he was going to exile them, and that their land would lay rest for the amount of years of the Shmittahs that they did not observe. In 2 Chronicles 36 and 20, it says, "Those who escaped the sword and carried off to Babylon, and they became slaves to him and his sons until the reign of the kingdom of Persia. Thus was fulfilled the word Yah spoken by the prophet Yirmiyahu, until the land has paid her Shabbats. For as long as it lay desolate, it would keep a Shabbat until the 70 years had passed." And so the children of Israel, the number of years that the land didn't rest, remember, we go back to the kingdom of Israel was split into two kingdoms, the southern and the northern kingdom. Well, the northern kingdom, the kingdom of Ephraim, had a different punishment than the kingdom of Judah.
Yeah.
Okay. In Ezekiel chapter 4, where they're laying on Ezekiel's laying on his sides, and it tells him, okay, you're going to lay this many days for the punishment of, it was actually 40 days for the punishment of Yehuda. And then, so if you look at the southern kingdom, when Yehuda was taken into captivity and the land had to lay rest for 40 years, that would have been in 586 BC when they were taken by the Babylonians. Okay. And so their punishment was those 40 years. Well, we know that many of them did return to the land later, because, we read about that in Ezra and Nehemiah and Jeremiah about them coming back, King Cyrus declaring that and coming back with Zerubbabel. But the northern kingdom, the house of Israel and Ephraim, they went into captivity by the Assyrians prior to that in 722 BC. And so they basically assimilated into the nations. We don't really see where a lot of them came back. But in Ezekiel, it says that their punishment was going to be 390 years. But remember, if you don't repent, in Leviticus, it says, if you don't repent of that sin, that you were going to have 7 times the punishment. So that's in Leviticus 26:18, that if you don't repent, 7 times that punishment. So 7 times 390 gives you a total of 2,730 years that the house of Ephraim would be in exile. And then, okay. So if we go back to when they were taken captive, the year of captivity, which was 722, and you count forward 2,730 years, you get to the year 2008. Okay. And it was around 1980s, late 90s that we see many Jewish believers coming to the realization that Yeshua was the Messiah, like Paul Wilbur, Marty Getz, Joel Chernoff, Ephraim Frank, Batya Wu, all those that were, in the faith. So they really started coming in the 80s and 90s. Okay. These people were the ones that were instrumental for us being the non-Jewish believers, coming to the knowledge of Torah. And, a lot of us came into this walk around 2000s. Okay. And think about the number here. We were first coming into this right around the timing of the punishment of Ephraim ending. Because that in 2008, if those numbers are right, is when the punishment for Ephraim would have ended. And so just think about how this relates to the Yovel and understanding how Yeshua, who is truly proclaiming our freedom from the one thing that separates us from Yah, which is death, and that we could be restored back to the land and our inheritance. And it is through, the Mashiach who would know which tribe we truly belong to, like the Orthodox Jews believe even today. They say that, the Mashiach is going to be the one who determines that. Yeah. But when you start looking, like I said, at, those numbers, the word fig tree, Hatanaim in Hebrew, and you look at the numerical value, it's 461. And you think about the 80 years for that generation, and you add 461 and 80 years, that's 541, which is actually the numerical value of the word Israel. So Israel being that picture of that fig tree and that generation that's going to see that redemption of that Jubilee happening.
And, we can't, I have to keep up with how many are making Aliyah. Mm-hmm. And it's unreal how many. Oh,
even more. Well, you're talking about making Aliyah right now.
Each month, I mean, it's coming in.
And if you don't know, Aliyah is when Jews are moving back to Israel. Where is it? I was going to look this up right here, right now, because
I've just been on Bridges of Peace, and they always send me a letter every month, how many.
I know. What was it?
I mean, every Jew in the whole world goes back.
Okay, here it is.
Yes.
Hopefully you can see. Let me see if I can show this. Turn all this up.
10, 20,000.
Can you see this lady on my phone? Okay.
Yeah.
I don't know if you recognize her, but this is Diane Neal. I used to love to watch CSI, like, crime movies or whatever. Diane Neal, she was the redheaded prosecutor on CSI. Yeah. Was it CSI or Law and Order? Law and Order. Oh, Law and Order. And she just made Aliyah. She is an Olah Hadash. She's actually in the process now. So she's posting about looking for houses all the time. She's like, oh my gosh, I'm going to look at another place. And then she's like, yeah. And that's one of the things that she was saying is she said, with everything going on in the world, there's all this crazy stuff going on. Yeah, there's war here. She said, but this is the one place I could be a Jew and not be afraid to be a Jew. And she said, we need to come home. But yeah, you're talking about Aliyah.
I mean, not only famous people, but other people. I mean, just I mean, it's just
well, and it needs to, and that's the thing. That's what I've always said is, if you're a Jew living in this country, you're still in exile, because that's what it says. that if you are if you are not in the land, you are still in exile. Now, I do want to look at one
Can I ask
last
a quick
Yep.
question? This
Sure,
is
go
something
ahead.
I've heard, and I wonder if just your thoughts on it. The 10 northern tribes, I've heard that they went into exile, like due to their disobedience for punishment in different, like, it was different waves according to like each tribe. And that's why you see massive waves starting in 2008, waking up at the same time. And to me, that made sense. Like, oh, maybe, it's according to whatever
Yeah.
tribe we're in, that's when we're waking up. But have you heard anything on that?
Well, and two, well, you got to think about where they were in the land. So when they came out, there were some territories that were closer to Assyria. There were some that were farther south. So it is going to happen, even though they were still the northern tribes, they were still farther south. So they didn't come out all at the exact same time. Yeah. And then two, I mean, that makes me think about in Ezekiel 37, where it talks about the two sticks. We always say, oh yeah, the stick of Yehuda and the stick of Ephraim. But what does it say on the stick of Yehuda? It says, written on that stick, it says not only Yehuda, but it also says those of Ephraim that are with them. So there is going to be a remnant that is going to be on that stick of Yehuda that is Ephraim, but there's also Ephraim on the second stick.
Yeah.
And of course they become one in his hand, but still that, is there. So yeah, I mean, I can see where it happens, and that's why you see the different waves. And that's why, we were talking earlier about like some of the things that people that are now coming into it, we didn't have, and I was talking about like the difference of, back when we first started doing this. I remember we didn't have yeah, we had internet, but we didn't have all the stuff and people and resources. We used to drive to Black Mountain. We used to go, to Columbia. We'd go to Myrtle Beach. We'd go to Tennessee. We'd go to North Carolina. We hunt just whatever was coming up. Is there anybody we knew that was even teaching anything remotely this? And then when you didn't have it, what did you do? You sat down. I sat there with my concordance and opened it up. And I mean, it took weeks to go through and look at verses, but that's
time I had been a believer about 7 years.
Yeah, when you went to
And Holy Spirit led me to the Fort Mill.
real to that, conference.
Prairie Stone, all them.
Yeah. And you still have some of them that are still in it today, but then you have some that have gone away from it. And then, yeah. Yeah.
And I know,
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. She stayed through it all, even though she hadn't been to the hospital, because y'all wanted, you wanted to hear you that.
Whole week down there. And come back and I was so over the church because it wasn't. I said, why would I never hear anything about it?
Yeah. And that was the thing. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Wait, what was it, Angelina?
for me, yeah, in 2020, it was such a crazy, I know I've shared this with you before, but it was definitely like the Isaiah 65:1 moment where he just like visited me and lifted that veil. It was like a supernatural, crazy thing. And it really resonates with the punishment being up. Like I did nothing to deserve all of a sudden seeing. And there's waves of people that I've connected with online that had very similar experiences in 2020.
Yeah.
It's just,
And that's
it's
the
really
thing.
cool.
It's, just see that, who's coming into it then, and then what are issues that they're facing then is different from others.
And you, about when you was 15 years old.
Okay, well, let's see. Let me keep going because so that we'll get back to it. So, but let's look at Revelation, because I do want to get to this part. Revelation chapter 2, because this is also brought up with anti-Semitism. In verse 8. And this is where we see, to the angel of the Messianic community in Smyrna, write, here is the message from the first and the last, who died and came alive again. I know you are suffering and how poor you are, though in fact you are rich. I know the insults of those who call themselves Jews, but aren't. On the contrary, they are the synagogue of Satan. Okay, so where we go. And they call themselves Jews, but they aren't, but they're a synagogue of Satan. Don't be afraid of what you're about to suffer. Look, the adversary is going to have some of you thrown into prison in order to put you to the test, and you will face an ordeal for 10 days. Remain faithful even to the point of death, and I will give you life as your crown. Those who have ears, let him hear what the Spirit is saying to the Messianic communities. He who wins the victory will not be hurt at all by the second death. To the angel of the Messianic community in Pergamum, right here is the message for the one who has the sharp double-edged sword. I know where you are living, that is where the adversary's throne is, but you're holding on to my name. You did not deny trusting in me at a time when my faithful witness Antipas was put to death in your town. There the adversary lives. Nevertheless, I have a few things against you. You have some of the people who hold on to the teaching of Bilam, who taught Balak to set a trap for the people of Israel so that they would eat food that had been sacrificed to idols and commit sexual sin. Okay, so when we look at that passage, or both of those, we see that we're talking about there's the synagogue of Satan. And they use this to talk about, okay, there's synagogue of Satan. And see, they say they're Jews, but they're not really Jews. But the problem is we don't know the history of what's happening. Because John Yochanan is talking to a specific congregation and what was going on at that time, and what does that phrase mean? Because when John wrote this, he was actually facing the persecution and of the Roman Emperor Domitian. And during the end of Domitian's empire, he suffered financial problems. And he knew that his legions would be upset and they would turn against the emperor if they were unhappy. And Domitian increased the taxes. Domitian's father was Vespasian, Emperor Vespasian. And Vespasian was the first one who introduced what was called the Jewish tax, the Fiscus Judaicus. And he did it in order to recoup his expenses from the war against the Jews, okay? However, by Domitian's time, the Jewish tax had now become essential to their spending because they were spending it regardless. And Roman law required every Jew to pay this tax. But the law did not define who was a Jew. So that ambiguity made many that were like these God-fearing Gentiles, non-Jewish believers, liable for this tax as well, because they look and are doing things just like the Jews, okay? They're celebrating the same days. They're going, observing Shabbat. They're not eating certain foods. So they are forced to the same tax. And the Roman authorities didn't distinguish between who was really halaically a Jew and those who weren't, okay? So this resulted in, some of the, people, that really weren't Jewish were getting taxed with this. And some other Jews tried to hide the fact that they were Jewish to avoid this tax. Well, Domitian at this time instituted this policy where the general public needs to inform on their neighbors or those who live around them in their midst. And as the informants would come forward, they would get paid, but also that Domitian discovered that there were many of these believers and Jewish people that were hiding underground, so to speak, okay? And there were these Christians that were observing the same days as the Jews, eating the same way as the Jews, doing the same holidays, but they weren't having, some of them weren't paying the tax because they were labeled as Christians. So Domitian then started, making this, policy where people are informing to report on their friends, their neighbors, or whatever. If you worship the Jewish God, if you practice these Jewish customs, then you would get taxed. And so Domitian wanted these Gentile believers to separate from anything Jewish. If you want to avoid that tax, then you don't do their holidays, you don't do the same thing. So he introduced these legal enactments in order to separate them, okay? And he basically was making this Roman law here, but is making it apply to the Jews. So he's trying to get those excluded. So some of them in self-preservation, started informing on others, just like you had there were Jews for Hitler during World War II that would inform on others. Okay. So, and we can imagine what was happening here. And so when we look at what he's writing here, John is addressing this issue, because what we don't see is that this is what was happening when the leaders of the Jewish community then started informing on these people. Okay. They started coming up and presenting a list that, they're saying these people are not Jews, but they're basically illegal members of this, whatever, that they're basically trying to inform on them and say that they're not Jews. And what does John say? John says that if you're informing on them, you are of the synagogue of Satan. Well, Satan means accuser. Well, what are you doing? These Jewish leaders in Smyrna and Philadelphia were denouncing these believers to these Roman authorities. They're basically becoming accusers of the brethren because they're accusing their own brothers. This doesn't mean that they were Satan worshipers or that the devil is controlling them or anything, but the term synagogue of Satan was actually a term that they used to talk about somebody that's informing on their brothers. And so when you think about this passage, you've got to really understand what these first century believers were going through and what they were saying in the context that the ancient text was written. And that, like I said, that it's basically saying that those that are Jews are not really Jews. It was in the historical context of basically this trying to, basically inform on these others and to separate these people from being, okay, if you want to identify as Christian, then here would be Christian, but you can't be Jewish. You can't do the same dates. You can't do the same way. You can't eat the same way. And that there was all of this anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic, anti-synagogue implications here.
And it was because they were believers, but they were trying to.
Yeah. And then some of them that weren't even believers, they were just Jewish, they were informing on this. So, and with all that, and I'll put some other links, like I know Halissa Elwine does I saw she had a podcast on the Synagogue of Satan too and stuff. I'll put those links in there, but it's wise for us to be humble when it comes and not to generalize about a whole group of people based on a few. Now, does that mean I think every Jew is great? No. There are bad Jews and there are good Jews, just like there are bad Palestinians and there are good Palestinians. I know both. But I believe that the roots of this anti-Semitism is, not just from when Yeshua came, because when you start going back historically, it is even before we started having non-Jewish people in these synagogues. Because if you go back to Esther, in the book of Esther was 480 BC. That's, 400 and something years before Yeshua came. And we already see that these anti-Jewish or hatred against the Jews was taking place then. And there's even a book, if you want to look that up, the book is called I got this one, The Roots of Pagan Anti-Semitism in the Ancient World. It's The Roots of Pagan Anti-Semitism in the Ancient World by J.N. Sylvester. I don't know how to say his last name. But because the word anti-Semitism didn't even come around until 1879. So,
well, that's the sure thing. You have to test everything, Stuart. Because right now,
yeah. Well, and you're going to
it's going to get worse.
Right. But the thing is, yeah, you got to do your research. Who's saying it? And even looking at the scripture, who is it speaking to, and what did it mean of that time period? Don't put it in the meaning of today. what I mean, like I've used this, analogy of like, if you use the word gay in the 1900 and you use the word gay today, it's two different meanings. So, and it's, made me think about the quote, and I always use this one when I did the Holocaust, is by Martin Niemöller, who was a pastor during World War II. And he wrote this, and he said, first they came for the socialist, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionist, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. And so, and that's part of the problem is some people don't want to speak up against anti-Semitism. And what happened when the church doesn't speak up against it, the Holocaust happened. Because there were people that were standing there watching the trains go by, and that happened. So with that said, I am going to stop the video because I do want to show this one thing at the end, and then we will pray. Okay. So, and that's heavy. I'm going to leave you on a heavy. So.